The Alcatraz Prisoners. Chapter 1. The Rock. There are places where history seems to cling to the walls. Places where the past doesn't feel finished. Alcatraz is one of them. Rising from the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, the island has become one of the most recognizable former prisons in the world. For decades, it was a place designed to keep people in. Now, long after the cells have been emptied, thousands of visitors arrive every year to walk through the same corridors, look through the same bars and imagine what life must have been like for the men who once called the island home. But there are stories that refuse to stay in the past. Stories of footsteps in empty corridors. Voices where nobody is standing. Cold spots that appear without explanation. And, according to some accounts, music. A banjo playing somewhere deep inside the prison. The story has become part of Alcatraz folklore. One of the most famous prisoners associated with the instrument was Al Capone, who reportedly played banjo while incarcerated there. Visitors and former workers have sometimes claimed that the faint sound of strings can still be heard in parts of the prison. Most people dismiss such stories. Buildings make noises. Old pipes vibrate. Wind moves through empty spaces. Memories can turn ordinary sounds into something extraordinary. But one former prison employee believed there was more to it. His name was Thomas Reed. Thomas had worked on Alcatraz during the final years before the prison closed. He wasn't a guard. He wasn't an inmate. He worked maintenance. His job took him into places tourists rarely saw. Basements, service corridors, storage rooms, old utility passages. He knew the building's sounds. And he knew the difference between a pipe settling and a footstep. Between wind and a door opening. Between imagination and something he couldn't explain. Years later, Thomas returned to the island as part of a small historical research project. He was in his 70s by then. The prison had been closed for decades. Most of the men he remembered were long gone. The island had become a museum, a historical site, a place where tourists took photographs and listened to recordings about famous prisoners. Thomas walked through the cell block slowly. He remembered the smell, the cold, the sound of steel doors closing. He stopped outside one particular cell. 14D. The number had been painted and repainted over the years. Thomas stared at it. Still here, he whispered. A young researcher named Daniel Mercer stood beside him. Daniel was producing a documentary about unusual stories connected to the prison. He had heard the legends. The phantom banjo, the footsteps, the stories of prisoners who claimed they had seen strange figures. But Daniel wasn't interested in proving ghosts existed. He wanted to know why certain stories survived. Thomas looked at him. You want to understand Alcatraz? Daniel nodded. Then don't start with the famous prisoners. Where should I start? Thomas pointed at the cell. The ones nobody remembers. Daniel looked at 14D. What happened here? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down the corridor. People used to talk. About this cell. About what happened near it. Daniel waited. Thomas finally said, there were nights when prisoners heard something. What? A man screaming. Daniel frowned. An inmate? That's what they thought. Was anyone found? No. Then what did they hear? Thomas looked toward the cell. Nobody could agree. Daniel noticed something in his expression. Did you hear it? Thomas nodded. Once. When? 1959. What happened? Thomas took a slow breath. It was after midnight. He described the prison as it had been then. The corridors quiet. The cells occupied. Guards moving through the tiers. Then, suddenly, a scream. Thomas said the sound came from somewhere near 14D. A guard rushed toward the area. Then another. But when they arrived, nothing was wrong. The prisoners were inside their cells. The corridor was empty. No injured man. No disturbance. Nothing. But several inmates insisted they had heard something. Then one prisoner said something that stayed with Thomas for the rest of his life. He claimed that, just before the scream, he had seen a pair of glowing eyes inside the darkness. Thomas shook his head. I didn't believe him. Daniel asked. Why? Because fear spreads quickly in a prison. He paused. Especially at night. Daniel looked through the bars of 14D. The cell was small. A bed, a toilet, a sink, bare walls. Nothing supernatural. Nothing mysterious. And yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the air inside the cell was colder than the corridor. He stepped closer. His camera suddenly clicked. Daniel looked down. He hadn't pressed the shutter. He checked the camera. The photograph showed the inside of 14D. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. Then he zoomed in. At the back of the cell, beside the wall, was a dark shape. It looked almost like a person. Daniel took another photograph. The shape was gone. Thomas saw the screen. His face changed. Don't take any more. Daniel looked at him. Why? Thomas pointed toward the cell. Because that's how it starts. Daniel gave a nervous laugh. How what starts? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he walked away. Daniel followed. They entered the next section of the cell block. A group of tourists passed them. Their guide was talking about Al Capone. Daniel heard the faint sound of laughter. Then something else. A quiet musical note. He stopped. Thomas stopped too. Daniel listened. Another note. Then another. A banjo. Faint. Coming from somewhere deeper inside the prison. Daniel looked at Thomas. The older man had gone completely still. You hear it? Thomas nodded. Yes. The music continued. Slowly. Almost like someone practicing. Daniel followed the sound. Thomas grabbed his arm. No. Why? Because the music isn't coming from the cell block. Daniel frowned. Then where? Thomas looked toward the floor. Below us. The banjo stopped. For several seconds, there was silence. Then came a single note. Directly beneath their feet. Daniel looked down. Thomas whispered, "That wasn't there when I worked here." A metal door at the end of the corridor suddenly opened. Nobody was standing near it. Beyond the doorway was a dark service passage. Daniel raised his camera. Thomas shook his head. Don't. But Daniel stepped forward. The temperature dropped. The smell of damp stone filled the corridor. And from somewhere in the darkness came the faint sound of a man humming. Daniel recognized the tune. It was an old banjo melody. Thomas whispered, "Al Capone used to play that." Daniel looked at him. "How do you know?" Thomas stared into the passage. "Because I heard him play it." Daniel frowned. Years after he died. Thomas didn't answer. The humming stopped. Then a voice came from the darkness. A man's voice. Low. Almost amused. "Who's there?" Daniel froze. Thomas stepped backward. The voice came again. "Who's there?" Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Approaching them from somewhere beneath the prison. Thomas whispered, "Don't answer." Daniel stared into the darkness. The footsteps stopped. A pale face appeared briefly at the far end of the passage. Then two eyes opened. They seemed to glow in the darkness. Daniel raised his camera. The flash exploded through the corridor. For 1 second, everything was visible. The empty passage, the old walls, the darkness, and a figure standing at the very end. Then the lights went out. Daniel heard Thomas whisper one final sentence. "Now it knows you're here." And somewhere in the darkness beneath Alcatraz, a banjo began to play. The Alcatraz Prisoners. Chapter 2, The Cell That Should Have Been Empty. The banjo continued playing. Daniel stood completely still. He could hear Thomas breathing beside him, quick and shallow. Neither man moved. The darkness seemed to press against him from every direction. Then the music stopped. Silence returned. Daniel lowered his camera. "Thomas?" No answer. He turned. The older man was staring toward the end of the passage. "Thomas, I heard that tune before." "Where?" Thomas swallowed. "Inside the prison." Daniel waited. "Tell me." Thomas looked at him. "Not here." He reached for Daniel's arm. "We're leaving." They walked quickly back toward the cell block. Daniel kept looking over his shoulder. Nothing followed them. When they reached the main corridor, the lights came back on. The ordinary sounds of the prison returned. Tourists talking, footsteps, a distant guide explaining the history of the island. It felt almost absurdly normal. Daniel checked his camera. The last photograph he'd taken showed the dark service passage. But the image was almost completely black. He increased the brightness. Something appeared. A face. Not at the end of the passage. Much closer. Almost directly in front of the camera. Daniel stared at it. The face belonged to a man. His eyes were closed. His mouth was open. And across his forehead was a dark horizontal mark. Daniel showed Thomas. The old man stepped away from the screen. "Delete it." "Why?" "Because I know that face." "Who is he?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't want to talk about him here." They returned to the main building. Daniel expected Thomas to explain everything. Instead, the older man disappeared into a staff room. When he returned, he carried a small cardboard box. He placed it on a table. Inside were old photographs, handwritten notes and photocopies of prison records. Daniel looked at him. "You kept these?" Thomas nodded. "I shouldn't have." "Why didn't you throw them away?" "Because I wanted to prove to myself that what I saw actually happened." Daniel began sorting through the papers. Most were ordinary. Maintenance reports, prison schedules, names of employees. Then he found a photograph. It showed a prison cell. The number was clearly visible. 14D. Daniel turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten note. October 1959. Below that, noise reported after midnight. Daniel looked at Thomas. Is this the night you mentioned? Thomas nodded. Yes. What happened? Thomas sat down. There was an inmate in that cell. Who? Nobody important. What's his name? Thomas hesitated. Arthur Bell. Daniel wrote the name down. What did he do? Nothing that would make the newspapers. Thomas looked at the photograph. He'd been hearing things. What kind of things? Music. Daniel frowned. Banjo? Thomas nodded. At first, the guards thought he was making it up. Why? Because he claimed the music was coming from inside the walls. Daniel looked at the photograph again. What happened to him? He disappeared. Daniel looked up. Escaped? No. Transferred? No. Then where did he go? Thomas's face tightened. He died. Daniel waited. How? That's the strange part. Thomas opened another file. Officially, he was found unconscious in his cell. 14D. Yes. Cause of death. Thomas pushed the document across the table. Daniel read it. The cause was listed as heart failure. But something was wrong. The date was October 14, 1959. Daniel looked at Thomas. What happened after he died? Nothing. Nothing, at least officially. Thomas opened another folder. 3 nights later, another inmate heard the music. Daniel leaned forward. Who? James Cooper. And he reported hearing banjo music outside his cell. Which cell? 14D. Daniel frowned. That's impossible. Why? Because Arthur Bell was dead. Thomas nodded. Exactly. Daniel turned another page. The report described the sound as faint string music. The inmate had refused to sleep. Then, at 2:15 in the morning, he reported seeing a figure standing at the end of the corridor. A man, wearing prison clothes. His face couldn't be seen. The report ended with a handwritten note. Inmate subsequently transferred. Daniel looked at Thomas. Where? San Quentin. Why? He asked to leave. Daniel looked through the remaining documents. Several inmates had reported similar incidents. Different years. Different names. Always the same location. 14D. Always the music. And occasionally, the figure. Daniel suddenly noticed something. A pattern in the dates. The final year of the prison. He checked the dates again. The incidents became more frequent toward the end. What happened in 1963? Thomas looked at him. The prison closed. Yes, but why were there more reports? Thomas was silent. Daniel pressed him. What aren't you telling me? Thomas sighed. There was one final incident. When? March 1963. Tell me. Thomas looked toward the corridor. It involved a guard. Name? Michael Harris. What happened? He was doing a routine inspection. At night? Yes. He entered the cell block alone. Thomas paused. Then he heard the banjo. Daniel looked at him. From 14D? Yes. What did he do? He opened the cell. Daniel frowned. Why? He thought an inmate was playing. But the cell was empty. Thomas nodded. Completely empty. Daniel looked at the photograph. Then what happened? He heard someone behind him. Thomas's voice became quieter. When he turned around, he saw a prisoner. Arthur Bell. We don't know. What did he look like? Michael said the man had been burned. Daniel felt a chill. Burned? His face. Was he injured? Michael said there was no skin. Daniel stared at him. What happened next? He fired his gun. At the figure? Yes. Did he hit him? There was nobody there. Daniel looked at the documents. Then, Michael ran. Was he okay, physically? What did he say? Thomas looked at Daniel. He said the figure had glowing eyes. The same detail. Daniel remembered the photograph from the previous night. The dark passage. The pale face. The eyes. He looked at Thomas. Did Michael ever work again? No. Why? He resigned. Did he explain why? Thomas nodded. He said the prison wasn't empty. Daniel closed the folder. The two men sat in silence. Then Daniel heard something. A faint sound. One musical note. He looked at Thomas. The old man's face went pale. Another note followed. Then another. The banjo. Inside the building. Daniel stood. Where is it coming from? Thomas whispered. 14D. They walked toward the cell block. This time there were no tourists. The corridor was empty. Daniel's footsteps echoed. Thomas stayed several meters behind him. As they approached 14D, the temperature dropped. Daniel could see his breath. The cell door was open. He stopped. Was that open before? Thomas shook his head. No. Daniel raised his camera. Inside the cell was the same bed. The same sink. The same small toilet. Nothing else. Then the banjo played again. Daniel stepped inside. The music stopped. He turned around. Thomas was standing in the corridor. Come in. No. Why? Thomas pointed toward the cell. Look at the wall. Daniel turned. At first he saw nothing. Then the light from his torch revealed scratches. Lines. Hundreds of them. He moved closer. They were names. Some were almost impossible to read. Some had dates. Daniel traced one with his finger. Arthur Bell, 1959. Another, Michael Harris, 1963. Daniel stepped back. That's impossible. Thomas didn't answer. There was another name. Thomas Reed. Daniel stared. The date beside it was blank. He turned slowly. Thomas. The old man looked at the wall. His face changed. I've never seen that. Your name is here. I know. When did you see it? Never. Daniel pointed at the blank space. Why is there no date? Thomas didn't answer. Then Daniel noticed another line underneath. A new name. The handwriting looked fresh. Daniel Mercer. Beside it was today's date. Daniel's heart began pounding. Thomas. The banjo started playing again. But this time it wasn't coming from somewhere deep inside the prison. It was coming from the cell. Daniel looked toward the corner. A shadow appeared on the wall. The unmistakable outline of a man sitting down, holding a banjo. Daniel raised his camera. The shadow lifted one hand and pointed directly at him. The banjo stopped. A voice whispered from the darkness, "You're late." Daniel froze. Thomas shouted, "Get out." The shadow disappeared. Daniel ran. They raced down the corridor. Behind them came footsteps. Then another sound. Metal doors began slamming shut one after another. Bang, bang, bang. The corridor seemed to close around them. Thomas grabbed Daniel. "Don't look back." Daniel ran faster. Then he heard a voice directly behind him. His own voice, whispering his name. Daniel. He turned. At the far end of the corridor stood a prisoner. His clothes were blackened. His face was pale, and his eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure raised one hand. In it was a banjo. Then the prison lights went out, and the sound of strings began again. This time, the music was coming from everywhere. The Alcatraz prisoners. Chapter 3. The man in the cell. The music came from everywhere. Daniel couldn't tell whether it was coming from the walls, the ceiling, or somewhere beneath his feet. The banjo melody echoed through the darkness. Slow, almost gentle, but there was something wrong with it. It sounded as though someone was playing the same few notes over and over, waiting for something to happen. Thomas grabbed Daniel's shoulder. "Stay close." Daniel could barely see him. The emergency lights flickered once. Then again. For a brief moment, the corridor appeared. Empty. Then darkness returned. "Thomas, I'm here." "Where's the figure?" "I don't know." Another flicker. Daniel looked toward 14D. The cell door was closed. Thomas stared at it. That wasn't closed before. Daniel took a step forward. "Don't." Thomas's voice was firm. "Whatever you do, don't open it." Daniel stopped. The banjo continued. Then came a sound that neither man expected. Laughter. A man's quiet laughter. From inside 14D, Daniel whispered, "Someone's in there." Thomas shook his head. "No one is." The laughter stopped. A voice followed. "Thomas." The older man went pale. Daniel looked at him. "You know that voice?" Thomas didn't answer. The voice came again. "Thomas Reed." Thomas took a step backward. "I haven't heard that voice in 60 years. Whose is it?" Thomas looked at Daniel. "Arthur Bell." Daniel stared at the cell door. "But Arthur is dead." "I know." The voice spoke again. "Thomas. Then, why did you leave me?" Thomas closed his eyes. Daniel saw tears forming. "What happened?" he asked. Thomas whispered, "I was there. When Arthur died." "Yes." "Then tell me what really happened." Thomas didn't answer. The door of 14D slowly opened. No one touched it. Inside was darkness. The banjo stopped. Thomas whispered, "We need to leave." Daniel shook his head. "Not until you tell me." Thomas looked at him. "I was a young maintenance worker." "How young?" 22. "What happened that night?" Thomas took a breath. Arthur had been complaining about music for weeks. "The banjo?" "Yes." "Did you hear it?" "Not at first." "What changed?" Arthur became convinced that someone was playing inside the wall. Daniel looked toward the cell. "Inside?" He said there was a room behind it. Daniel frowned. "There isn't." That's what everyone told him. Thomas continued. "One night, he asked me to help him." "Why you?" "Because I'd worked maintenance." "What did he want?" "To open the wall." Daniel stared. "Did you?" Thomas nodded. We removed part of the panel. And there was a cavity. How big? Large enough for a man. Daniel felt a chill. What was inside? Thomas's voice became barely audible. Nothing. Nothing. At least, that's what I thought. He looked toward 14D. Then I heard the music. Daniel waited. From inside the cavity, Thomas nodded. Arthur heard it too. What happened? Arthur climbed inside. Daniel stared at him. Why? He said someone was calling him. Who? His mother. Daniel frowned. His mother was dead. Thomas nodded. Years earlier. Daniel felt cold. What happened to Arthur? He disappeared. Inside the wall? Yes. And you didn't tell anyone? Thomas looked ashamed. We closed it. Why? Because we were frightened. Daniel stared at him. You sealed a man inside? No. Thomas's voice broke. When we opened it again, he was gone. Daniel said nothing. There was no body, no evidence, nothing. Then why did you believe he had died? Thomas looked toward the darkness. Because 3 days later, they found him in his cell. Daniel's face tightened. But you just said he disappeared. I know. So how? Thomas shook his head. That's the part I've spent 60 years trying to understand. The banjo began again. This time, the melody was different. Daniel recognized it. It was the same tune he had heard earlier. But now there was another sound beneath it. A woman's voice humming. Thomas stared into the cell. That's impossible. What? That melody. What about it? Arthur never knew that song. Daniel looked at him. Then who is playing? The humming stopped. A whisper came from inside the cell. Daniel. He froze. Thomas turned. Don't answer. Daniel whispered. How does it know my name? Thomas looked at the wall. The scratches had changed. Daniel stepped closer. The names were still there. But more had appeared. Fresh scratches. Arthur Bell, 1959. Michael Harris, 1963. Thomas Reed. And beneath them, Daniel Mercer. The date was today's date. Daniel reached toward it. The moment his finger touched the wall, the entire corridor seemed to disappear. He was no longer standing inside the prison. He was somewhere else. A cell. Dark. Cold. A man sat on the bed. His back was toward Daniel. A banjo rested across his knees. Daniel whispered, Arthur. The man slowly turned. His face was pale. Not burned. Not monstrous. Just terribly tired. You're looking for the prisoner. Daniel stared. Who? Arthur pointed toward the cell door. Me. But you're dead. Arthur smiled. That's what they wrote. Daniel looked around. What is this? The place between. Between what? Being remembered and being forgotten. Daniel felt a strange pressure in his ears. Why are you here? Arthur looked down at the banjo. Because someone has to play. Why? Arthur looked at him. To keep them asleep. Daniel frowned. Who? The floor beneath him seemed to tremble. Arthur's expression changed. The ones underneath. Daniel stepped backward. What is underneath Alcatraz? Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the wall. Listen. Daniel heard something. Not the banjo. Something deeper. A low vibration. Like thousands of voices whispering beneath the ground. Then Arthur said, they were here before the prison. Daniel looked at him. Who were? Arthur's eyes filled with fear. The prisoners. Daniel frowned. But the prison was built to hold prisoners. Arthur shook his head. No. He leaned closer. The prison was built because they were already here. Daniel's surroundings began to fade. Wait. Arthur raised the banjo. Don't let them hear you. Who? Arthur whispered. The ones who don't have names. Daniel opened his eyes. He was back inside 14D. Thomas was standing over him. Daniel. Daniel looked around. What happened? You collapsed. For how long? Seconds. Daniel looked at the wall. The fresh writing was gone. Every name had disappeared. The wall was blank. Thomas stared at it. No. What? It shouldn't be blank. Daniel turned toward him. What did you see? Thomas looked frightened. You tell me. Daniel remembered Arthur. The banjo. The words. The prisoners beneath the prison. He wasn't sure whether to believe any of it. Then something moved inside the cell. Daniel and Thomas both turned. A banjo lay on the floor. Neither had seen it there before. Thomas whispered, that's his. Daniel stared. Arthur's. Thomas nodded. Yes. Daniel approached it carefully. The instrument looked old. The wood was scratched. The strings were worn. He crouched beside it. There was a small metal plate attached to the back. Daniel wiped away dust. An inscription appeared. AB below it was a date. 1959. Thomas whispered, don't touch it. Daniel reached toward the banjo. His fingers were almost touching the strings. Then the instrument played a single note. Neither man had touched it. The sound echoed through the cell. And somewhere far below them, something answered. One deep knock, then another, then another. Thomas stepped backward. Daniel stood. What's down there? Thomas looked at the floor. I don't know. The knocking continued. 3 times. Then 6. Then 12. It sounded as if dozens of hands were striking the underside of the prison floor. Daniel looked at Thomas. We need to get out. Thomas nodded. They turned toward the corridor. But the exit was no longer there. The passage had changed. Where the corridor should have been was a solid wall. Daniel stared. That's not possible. Thomas whispered. The prison is changing. A faint light appeared at the end of another passage. Daniel heard footsteps. Someone was approaching. Then a man's voice called from the darkness. Thomas. Thomas froze. Daniel looked at him. Who is that? Thomas didn't answer. The voice came again, this time closer. Thomas Reed. Thomas whispered, my brother. Daniel stared. You said you didn't have a brother. Thomas looked terrified. I didn't. The footsteps came closer. A shadow appeared. Then a man stepped into the light. He looked exactly like Thomas, but much younger. He was wearing a prison uniform. Thomas stumbled backward. The younger man smiled. Hello, Tommy. Daniel looked between them. Who is he? Thomas couldn't speak. The young prisoner lifted one hand. In it was a small piece of paper. He held it toward Daniel. Daniel took it. There was one sentence written on it. The Rock doesn't keep prisoners. Daniel looked up. The young man was gone. The paper slipped from his hand. On the other side was another sentence. It keeps the count. And from somewhere deep beneath their feet, the banjo began playing again. The Alcatraz Prisoners. Chapter 4. The Count Beneath the Rock. The banjo played 3 notes. Then stopped. Daniel stood in the middle of the corridor, staring at the piece of paper in his hand. The Rock doesn't keep prisoners. He turned it over. It keeps the count. Thomas looked at the words. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Daniel asked the question that had been troubling him since the beginning. What count? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. You just saw a man who looked exactly like you. I know what I saw. You said you didn't have a brother. I don't. Then who was he? Thomas looked toward the darkness. I don't know. The older man suddenly pointed. Look, the corridor had changed again. The solid wall that had blocked their exit was gone. Beyond it was a passage they had never seen before. A narrow staircase descended into darkness. Daniel looked at Thomas. That wasn't there before. No. Where does it go? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. Daniel switched on his torch. The beam disappeared down the stairs. There were metal railings on both sides. The steps were worn smooth. And on the wall beside the staircase were numbers. 1, then 2, then 3. Daniel slowly counted them. 14 numbers. At the bottom was a 15th. But beside it was something different. A name. Arthur Bell. Thomas stared. That's impossible. Daniel looked at him. Why? Because Arthur was never assigned a number. Maybe this isn't about inmates. Thomas said nothing. They began descending. The air became colder with every step. The sounds of the prison above disappeared. No tourists. No voices. No footsteps. Only the sound of their own breathing. At the bottom, Daniel found a metal door. There was no handle, only a small rectangular opening. Thomas shone his torch through it. Nothing. Then Daniel heard something. Music. Very faint. The banjo. Thomas stepped back. We should go. Daniel shook his head. Not now, Daniel. We've already come this far. Thomas looked at him. You don't understand. Then explain it. Thomas sighed. When I first started working here, there were stories about this place. What place? Below the prison. Was it real? I thought it was just a story. What did they call it? Thomas hesitated. The lower cell block. Daniel frowned. There isn't a lower cell block. Not officially. Daniel looked at the door. Then what is it? Thomas whispered. That's what nobody could agree on. Daniel tried the door. It opened. Beyond it was a large underground chamber. It looked nothing like the prison above. The walls were rough stone rather than concrete. Old wooden beams crossed the ceiling. There were dozens of metal doors. Each one had a number. Daniel swept his torch across them. 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted. 14. Then a 15th. The door was different. It had no number. Instead, someone had scratched a single word into the metal. Remember. Daniel approached. Thomas stayed behind. Don't open that. Daniel turned. Why? Because I don't think we're supposed to. Daniel looked at the other doors. Who is behind them? Thomas shook his head. I don't know. A sound came from one of the numbered cells. 3 knocks. Daniel looked toward it. Then another. 3 more. A third door answered. Then another. Soon the entire chamber was filled with knocking. Door after door, one after another, like prisoners communicating through the walls. Daniel counted. 14 doors. 14 knocks. Then the 15th door remained silent. Thomas whispered, "That's the one." Daniel looked at the unnumbered door. The one what? The empty one. Daniel stepped toward it. What happened to whoever was inside? Thomas stared at the door. They didn't leave. Daniel put his hand on the metal. It was freezing. Then a voice came from the other side. Daniel. He pulled his hand away. Thomas looked at him. What did it say? You heard it. No. The voice came again. Daniel. It sounded like his own voice. Daniel stepped closer. Who are you? Silence. Then, you're asking the wrong question. Daniel looked at Thomas. What question should I ask? The voice answered. Who counted you? Daniel's heart began pounding. What does that mean? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the 14 doors opened simultaneously. Daniel jumped backward. Inside each cell was a single object. Cell 1 contained an old pair of shoes. Cell 2 contained a prison uniform. Cell 3 contained a photograph. Cell 4 contained a wedding ring. Cell 5 contained a child's toy. Each object appeared ordinary, but each seemed connected to someone who had once been inside Alcatraz. Daniel moved from door to door. The objects continued. A pocket watch, a Bible, a comb, a letter, a pair of spectacles, a wooden cross, a newspaper clipping, a banjo string, and finally, in cell 14, nothing. The cell was completely empty. Daniel looked at Thomas. Why is 14 empty? Thomas didn't answer. Daniel entered. There was writing on the wall. Not names this time. A sentence. The 14th is always the one WHO returns. Daniel felt a chill. Returns from where? The lights suddenly flickered. The banjo began playing. Thomas backed toward the stairs. Daniel, come on. Daniel looked into cell 15. The unnumbered door was still closed. But something was visible beneath it. A shadow. Feet. Someone was standing inside. Daniel whispered, "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. Then the voice came. Open the door. Daniel looked at Thomas. Should I? No. The voice spoke again. Open the door, Daniel. Daniel felt strangely compelled. His hand moved toward the door. Thomas grabbed him. No. Daniel pulled free. Why? Because that's how Arthur disappeared. Daniel froze. What? Thomas pointed toward the unnumbered cell. That's where he went. Arthur. Thomas nodded. He opened the door. And he heard the music. Daniel stared at the door. What happened after that? Thomas looked down. He walked inside. Then, the door closed. And when you opened it, Thomas's voice broke. Arthur was gone. Daniel stepped back. Then how did he die in 14D? Thomas shook his head. He didn't. The banjo stopped. Daniel looked at him. What? Arthur Bell never died in 14D. Thomas pointed toward the wall. The man found in that cell wasn't Arthur. Daniel felt a wave of cold move through him. Then who was it? Thomas whispered. We never knew. A loud metallic sound came from cell 15. The door moved. Just slightly. Daniel stepped back. Then it opened. Inside was a small room. At the center stood a wooden chair. On the chair was an old prison uniform. Beside it sat a banjo. Daniel recognized it immediately. Arthur's. But there was something else. A photograph. Daniel picked it up. It showed 14 prisoners standing in the cell block. Thomas appeared among them. Daniel stared. Thomas. The older man looked at the photograph. His face drained of color. That's not possible. Why? Because that photograph was taken in 1959. Daniel looked again. Thomas was standing in the back row. But he looked exactly as he did now. Older. Not 22. 70 years old. Daniel slowly turned toward him. You were there. Thomas shook his head. No. You said you were 22. I was. Then why do you look exactly like you do now? Thomas didn't answer. Daniel looked at the photograph again. There was another detail. A 15th person stood behind the prisoners. His face was obscured. Daniel raised the photograph toward the light. The face became visible. It was Daniel. Not an older version. Not a younger version. Daniel as he looked now. He dropped the photograph. Thomas stared at him. What does it mean? Daniel couldn't answer. Then the banjo on the chair began playing by itself. A slow melody filled the room. The wooden chair moved. Just slightly. Backwards. Then forwards. Like someone was sitting in it. Daniel stepped away. The banjo continued. A voice whispered from the darkness, 14 entered. Another voice answered, 14 left. Then a third voice, but one remained. Daniel looked at Thomas. Who remained? Thomas whispered, Arthur. The first voice spoke again. No. The banjo stopped. The room became completely silent. Then the voice said, Daniel. He looked toward the empty chair. The prison uniform slowly rose from it. As though an invisible person had stood up. The uniform remained suspended for several seconds. Then dropped to the floor. Behind it, scratched into the wall, were 4 words. The 15th is watching. Daniel felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He turned. Nobody was there, but Thomas was staring past him. His face had gone white. What? Thomas pointed toward the doorway. A figure stood there. The burned prisoner. The same glowing eyes. The same blackened uniform. But this time Daniel could see his face. It wasn't Arthur. It was Michael Harris, the former guard. He raised one finger to his lips. Then pointed downward. Daniel looked at the floor. A small metal hatch had appeared beneath their feet. And from beneath it came a sound they had heard before. Knocking. Not 3 times. Not 14. But 15. Knock. 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 Daniel stared at the hatch. Michael Harris whispered, He's awake. Thomas grabbed Daniel's arm. Run. The hatch began to open. Something moved beneath it, and from the darkness came a sound that silenced the banjo completely. A deep, slow breathing. Whatever had been beneath Alcatraz was no longer asleep. The Alcatraz prisoners. Chapter 5. What lies beneath? The breathing continued. Slow, deep, almost impossibly deep. Daniel stood frozen beside the open hatch. Thomas had both hands gripping his shoulders. Don't look down. Daniel couldn't help himself. He looked. At first, there was only darkness. Then something moved, not upward, sideways, as though something enormous was passing beneath the floor. Daniel stepped back. The hatch slammed shut. The sound echoed through the chamber. Michael Harris was gone. The old photograph remained on the floor. Daniel picked it up. The 15th figure had disappeared. Now there were only 14 prisoners. Thomas looked at the photograph. It's changing. Daniel nodded. Why? I don't know. Thomas, I need you to tell me everything. I've already told you. No. Daniel pointed toward the photograph. You've been here before. Thomas said nothing. You knew about the lower chambers. Silence. You knew about Arthur. Thomas closed his eyes. And now you're telling me you don't know what's happening. Thomas finally spoke. I know more than I told you. Daniel waited. Thomas looked toward the hatch. But I don't know enough. Then start with the truth. Thomas sighed. When I was 22, I worked maintenance on Alcatraz. Yes, but I wasn't just repairing pipes and electrical systems. What else? There were sections of the island we weren't supposed to enter. Why? Because they were old. How old? Older than the prison. Daniel stared. How old? Nobody knew. Thomas explained that workers occasionally found strange stonework beneath the prison. Old walls. Blocked passages. Rooms that weren't on any official plans. At first, everyone assumed they were abandoned construction areas. But there were things that didn't make sense. The doors were sometimes found open. Tools disappeared. Sounds traveled through the walls. And occasionally, workers heard music. Always the same banjo melody. Daniel looked at him. Did the guards know? Some did. Why wasn't it investigated? Thomas gave a bitter smile. Because Alcatraz had a reputation. What do you mean? Anything strange could be blamed on the prisoners. Daniel understood. If something went missing, blame an inmate. If someone heard voices, blame stress. If a worker refused to enter a tunnel, say he was frightened. Thomas looked at him. People believed whatever explanation allowed him to go home. Daniel looked at the hatch. And Arthur. Thomas's face tightened. Arthur found the lower chamber. How? He was working in the laundry. He wasn't maintenance. No. Then how? Arthur was curious. Thomas explained that Arthur had discovered a loose section of wall behind a storage room. Beyond it was a narrow passage. Arthur told another inmate. The story spread. Eventually, several prisoners knew about it. They started going down there. Why? They believed there was another way off the island. Daniel frowned. An escape route. Exactly. Was there? No. What was there? Thomas looked toward the floor. The doors. Daniel remembered the chamber. 14 numbered doors. One unnumbered door. What did they find? Nothing at first. Then, one prisoner opened a door. What happened? He heard his name. Daniel felt cold. Then, he disappeared. Did anyone find him? 3 days later. Dead. Thomas nodded. Where? In his cell. Daniel stared. 14D. Yes. Daniel looked toward the corridor. The same thing happened to Arthur. Thomas nodded. So the thing beneath the prison wasn't killing them. Thomas shook his head. Not exactly. What does that mean? It was replacing them. Daniel felt a chill. Replacing them with what? Thomas looked at him. Memories. Daniel didn't understand. Explain. People who went into the lower chambers sometimes came back. But they weren't quite the same. How? They remembered things that hadn't happened. Daniel thought about the younger version of Thomas. Like having a brother. Thomas nodded. I never had a brother. But you remember him? Yes. Daniel looked disturbed. What's his name? Thomas stared into space. David. Where did he come from? I don't know. Was he real? Thomas shook his head. I don't think so. Daniel looked at the old photograph. Then why do you remember him? Thomas answered quietly. Because something wanted me to. The banjo began playing again. Both men turned. The sound was coming from the chamber. The instrument sat on the wooden chair. Nobody was touching it. Daniel approached slowly. Why does it keep playing? Thomas whispered. Maybe it isn't music. Daniel looked at him. What is it? A warning. The melody changed. Daniel suddenly recognized the pattern. 3 notes. Pause. 3 notes. Pause. Then 15 rapid notes. He counted. That's a message. Thomas nodded. Yes. What's it saying? Thomas looked toward the hatch. Come. Daniel stared at him. That's what it means. No. Thomas's face was grim. It means someone is coming. The doors around the chamber began opening. 1, 2, 3. Daniel backed away. Inside each doorway was darkness. Then figures appeared. Prisoners. 14 of them. Standing silently. None moved. None spoke. Their faces were pale. Their uniforms belonged to different periods. Some looked like ordinary inmates. Others looked burned. One wore a guard's uniform. Daniel recognized Michael Harris. The figures all turned toward him. Thomas whispered, they're waiting. For what? For the 15th. Daniel looked around. Who is the 15th? Every figure pointed toward him. Daniel's heart stopped. The banjo played one final note. Then all 14 figures disappeared. The chamber was empty. Daniel looked at Thomas. What do they want? Thomas shook his head. They want you to take someone's place. Whose? Thomas looked at the unnumbered door. Arthur's. Daniel stepped backward. No. Thomas grabbed him. You have to leave. How? The stairs. Daniel turned. The staircase had disappeared. In its place was a solid wall. Thomas swore. Then the other passage. He pointed toward a narrow opening. They ran. The passage twisted through the rock. Daniel's torch flickered. Behind them came footsteps. Many footsteps. They didn't sound human. Some were heavy. Some were dragging. Some seemed to come from the walls themselves. Daniel ran faster. Then he heard his mother's voice. Daniel. He stopped. Thomas shouted, don't listen. The voice came again. Daniel, please. He closed his eyes. It sounded exactly like her. Don't leave me. Daniel knew it wasn't real. But the voice knew exactly what to say. Thomas pulled him forward. Keep moving. They reached another chamber. This one contained an old metal table. On it was a ledger. Daniel stopped. The cover was black. There was no title. He opened it. The first page contained 14 names. Arthur Bell, Michael Harris, and 12 others. Each name had a date. Some were from the 1950s. Others were older, much older. Daniel turned the page. There was another list. Names of guards, maintenance workers, prisoners, visitors, every person who had supposedly encountered the lower chambers. At the bottom was a blank line. Daniel knew what it meant. He closed the book. Thomas whispered, don't write your name. I won't. Whatever happens, don't. Daniel looked at the ledger. What happens if I do? Thomas hesitated. You become part of the place. And if I don't? Thomas looked toward the tunnel. It finds someone else. Daniel stared at him. Who? Thomas didn't answer. The ledger opened by itself. The blank line filled with ink. Daniel watched. Letters appeared slowly. Daniel Mercer. He grabbed the book. The ink spread across the page. Then another name appeared beneath his. Thomas Reed. Thomas stared. No. Daniel looked at him. Why your name? Thomas backed away. No, Thomas, I already paid. What? I already paid for leaving. Daniel didn't understand. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph. It showed the young Thomas standing beside Arthur Bell. Behind them was the entrance to the lower chamber. Daniel looked closer. Arthur was holding something, a banjo, and standing beside him was another man. Daniel's stomach tightened. The third man was Thomas. But there was something impossible about him. He looked exactly as he did now. Daniel looked at Thomas. "You've been here all along." Thomas shook his head. "No." "Then who is that?" Thomas stared at the photograph. His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know." The lights went out. A voice whispered from the darkness. "Yes, you do," Thomas screamed. Daniel grabbed his arm. The floor suddenly shifted beneath them. The chamber tilted. The ledger fell. The hatch opened. This time, something came through. A hand. Pale, thin, human-looking. It gripped the edge of the opening. Then another hand appeared. Thomas pulled Daniel backward. "Run!" They fled through the tunnel. Behind them came the sound of something climbing out. Not running, walking, slowly, patiently. The banjo began playing again. Daniel looked back once. He wished he hadn't. A figure stood in the tunnel. It was wearing an old prison uniform. Its face was hidden, but its eyes glowed, and in its hand was a banjo. The figure raised one finger, then pointed at Daniel. A voice filled the tunnel. 15. Daniel turned and ran. Ahead, a faint light appeared. The exit. They were almost there. Thomas suddenly stopped. Daniel grabbed him. "What are you doing?" Thomas looked at him. "I can't leave." "Why?" "Because I already left once." Daniel stared. Thomas smiled sadly. "I was never supposed to come back." Behind them, the footsteps stopped. The banjo stopped. Everything became silent. Thomas pushed Daniel toward the light. "Go. I'm not leaving you. You have to." "Thomas, go." Daniel ran. He reached the stairs. Then he heard Thomas scream. Daniel turned. The tunnel behind him was empty. Thomas was gone. On the floor lay the old banjo. Daniel picked it up. A single string vibrated. Then a whisper came from somewhere behind him. "One more prisoner." Daniel dropped the instrument. The prison lights came back on. And for the first time, Daniel realized he was alone. The Alcatraz prisoners. Chapter 6, The 15th Prisoner. Daniel stood alone in the corridor. The silence was worse than the music. He could hear his own breathing. Nothing else. "Thomas." His voice echoed down the passage. No answer. He called again. "Thomas." Still nothing. Daniel looked at the banjo lying on the floor. He didn't want to touch it. He didn't want to know why it was there. But something told him he couldn't leave it behind. He picked it up. The moment his fingers touched the strings, a sound came from somewhere inside the walls. 3 knocks. Daniel froze. 3 more, then 3 again. He remembered what Thomas had told him. The banjo wasn't music, it was a warning. Daniel looked toward the exit. The way out was visible. But something felt wrong. He started walking. 1 step, then another. The corridor seemed longer than before. The walls appeared to stretch away from him. He walked faster. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Daniel stopped. The footsteps stopped. He turned. Nothing. He continued. The footsteps followed. Slow, measured, never getting closer, never falling behind. Daniel finally reached the main cell block. The familiar prison corridor appeared ahead. Tourist signs, steel bars, old cells, the normal Alcatraz. He almost laughed with relief. Then he noticed something. There were people standing in the corridor. 14 prisoners. Silent, motionless. Daniel stopped. They were the same figures he'd seen below. But now they looked almost normal. One of them stepped forward. "You're late." Daniel looked at him. "Where is Thomas?" The prisoner didn't answer. Another spoke. He chose. Chose what? To stay. Daniel shook his head. He didn't choose. The prisoner looked at him. "Everyone chooses." Daniel glanced toward the exit. "Let me out." The prisoner smiled. "You can leave." Daniel frowned. "Then move." The prisoners stepped aside. The corridor was clear. Daniel walked toward the exit. But before he reached it, he heard something. A banjo, soft, coming from behind him. He turned. The 14 prisoners were gone. The corridor was empty, except for Thomas. He was standing beside cell 14D. Daniel ran toward him. "Thomas." The older man looked at him. But something was wrong. He looked much younger. His face was smooth. His hair dark. He was wearing the same maintenance uniform Daniel had seen in the old photographs. Daniel stopped. "Thomas." The younger man smiled. "You made it out." Daniel stared. "What happened to you?" "I remembered." "Remembered what?" "Why I came here." Daniel looked toward 14D. "You were never just maintenance." Thomas shook his head. "No." "Then what were you?" Thomas looked toward the cell. "A prisoner." Daniel felt cold. But your records, they were changed. By who? Thomas smiled. The same people who changed everything else. Daniel stepped closer. Who are you really? Thomas looked directly at him. I was the 15th. Daniel's heart began pounding. The 15th prisoner. Thomas nodded. But then what about Arthur? Arthur was the 14th. Daniel shook his head. The records say. The records aren't the truth. Thomas pointed toward the cell. Nobody ever escaped Alcatraz. Daniel frowned. But prisoners escaped. Some tried. And the famous escape? Thomas smiled. That's another story. Daniel looked at him. What happened to the men who disappeared? Thomas's expression became serious. They didn't escape. Then where did they go? Thomas pointed toward the floor. Down. The banjo played one note. Daniel looked at it. It was lying on the ground. He had left it behind. Thomas looked at the instrument. It's time. For what? The count. Daniel backed away. What happens now? Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door to 14D. Inside was the same small cell. Bed, sink, toilet, bare walls. But now there was something written above the bed. A number, 15. Daniel stepped inside. The door closed behind him. Thomas remained outside. Daniel turned. Thomas. The older man smiled. Don't be afraid. What's happening? The rock needs someone to remember. Remember what? Everyone. Daniel looked at the walls. Names began appearing. Hundreds. Thousands. Prisoners. Guards. Workers. Visitors. People who had died. People who had disappeared. People whose names had never appeared in official records. The walls filled with them. Daniel felt tears in his eyes. The prison suddenly seemed less like a place of punishment, and more like a monument. A place holding memories that the outside world had forgotten. Then the banjo began playing. Daniel looked toward the corner. A man was sitting on the bed. Arthur Bell. He looked ordinary, tired, human. Daniel approached him. Are you real? Arthur smiled. Does it matter? I need to know. You always do. Daniel sat opposite him. What happened here? Arthur looked around the cell. People came here carrying their secrets. And they left carrying different ones. Why? Because the rock remembers. Daniel frowned. That's what Thomas said. Arthur nodded. Thomas remembered too much. Where is he? Arthur looked toward the door. Where he always was. Daniel turned. The door was open. Thomas stood outside. But now he looked old again. Very old. Older than Daniel had ever seen him. Arthur whispered, he has been waiting for you. Daniel looked back. What happens to me? Arthur smiled sadly. That's your choice. Do I become a prisoner? No. Then what? The keeper. Daniel stared. The keeper of what? Arthur pointed toward the walls. The memories. Daniel shook his head. I don't want this. Arthur nodded. I know. Then why me? Because you came looking. Daniel remembered the documentary, the investigation, the photographs, the stories. He had believed he was investigating a haunting. But perhaps he had been doing something else. He had been opening doors, remembering names, bringing forgotten stories back into the light. Arthur stood. You have one last decision. What? Forget. Daniel stared at him. You mean I can leave and forget all of this? Arthur nodded. And Thomas? Forgotten. The prisoners? Forgotten. The caves beneath the prison? Forgotten. Daniel looked at the walls. Thousands of names. Thousands of lives. Some remembered. Some erased. He thought about Thomas, the man who had spent decades carrying memories he couldn't explain. He thought about Arthur, the prisoner whose name had survived long after his official story had disappeared. Daniel shook his head. I won't forget. Arthur smiled. Then you understand. The banjo stopped. The cell door opened. Bright daylight filled the corridor. Daniel stepped outside. The 14 prisoners were gone. Thomas was gone. The lower staircase was gone. The strange chamber was gone. Everything looked normal. Daniel walked toward the exit. When he reached the main entrance, a park employee looked at him. Sir, Daniel stopped. Yes. Are you all right? Daniel nodded. Yes. The employee smiled. You look like you've seen a ghost. Daniel almost laughed. Something like that. He walked outside. The cold wind from San Francisco Bay hit his face. For several minutes he stood looking back at Alcatraz. The island looked ordinary. Just stone, concrete, steel, history, nothing more. Daniel returned home that evening. He placed the banjo on his desk. He didn't remember bringing it with him. He stared at it. Then he opened his notebook. He began writing. Not about ghosts. Not about monsters. Not about glowing eyes. He wrote the names. one after another: Arthur Bell, Michael Harris, Thomas Reed, and hundreds more. He wrote until sunrise. When he finally stopped, the notebook contained a single sentence at the bottom of the last page. The dead are not always haunting the living. Sometimes they are simply waiting to be remembered. Daniel closed the notebook. The room was silent. Then he heard something. One banjo note. He looked toward the instrument. It hadn't moved. Another note. Then a third. Daniel smiled. Thomas, nothing. He waited. The banjo played the old melody one final time, then stopped. Years later, Daniel would publish his documentary. He would include the history of Alcatraz, the famous prisoners, the escape attempts, the harsh conditions, the stories told by former inmates and visitors. But he would never mention the lower chamber. He would never reveal the names on the walls. And he would never explain the banjo. When people asked him whether he believed Alcatraz was haunted, Daniel always gave the same answer: "I don't know." Then, after a pause, he would add, "But I think places remember." Sometimes, late at night, Daniel would receive photographs from tourists visiting the island. Most were ordinary: cell blocks, the bay, the prison yard, the famous corridors. But every few months, one photograph would contain something strange. A shadow, a blurred figure, a face behind a window, and occasionally, a 15th person, always standing somewhere in the background, never looking directly at the camera, until one photograph arrived that changed everything. It showed a group of 14 tourists standing outside cell 14D. Daniel counted them: 1, 2, 3, 4. He counted again: 14. Then he noticed someone standing behind the group. A man in an old maintenance uniform. Daniel zoomed in. It was Thomas, older, but smiling. Beside him stood Arthur Bell. And between them was a third figure: Daniel. The photograph had been taken that morning. Daniel had not been on Alcatraz. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he noticed the final detail: the banjo. It was hanging from Thomas's shoulder. Daniel's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then he heard a familiar voice. Thomas. Daniel. Daniel closed his eyes. Yes, we're missing one. Daniel opened his eyes. Who? There was a pause. Then Thomas whispered, "Me." The line went dead. Daniel looked across the room. The banjo was gone, and on the wall above his desk, scratched into the paint, were 3 words: "The count continues." Daniel stood there in silence. Outside, the city carried on. Cars moved. People laughed. Lights shone across the bay. And somewhere, far away on a small island surrounded by cold water, a banjo began to play. The end. This story is a fictional Incognito Stories interpretation inspired by the real history, legends and reported folklore surrounding Alcatraz Island. The characters, supernatural events, lower chambers, count, and investigation presented here are fictional and should not be taken as historical fact. Thank you for watching Incognito Stories. We really appreciate it. God bless and good night. It really means a lot.